Good evening, everyone. I like to welcome all of you on behalf of Bandra Kurla CP Study Circle. Today we have a very distinguished speaker. I would like to introduce him. Today we have with us CA Mukesh Doot. He is both CA and CS, having 15 plus years experience in banking in FEMA domain. He is in CA in service. He's currently working with Citibank Mumbai in business banking segment as business banking specialist for Mumbai for SME, MNC and startup. Prior to joining Citi, he had the opportunity to work in ICICI Bank and Yes Bank. He has worked in FEMA regulatory unit in bank and has got strong experience in FEMA regulation. He also has external certification as well on trade finance from Institute of Banking and Finance UK. Apart from taking internal sessions in bank, he has taken 50 plus knowledge sharing session on FEMA with external law firm, CA firm across metro cities in last 4 years. With this brief introduction, I welcome CA Mukesh Doot and ask him to take over the session.
Sure, thank you, Mangesh, and thanks everyone for your time for this session. It's indeed my pleasure as well that I have this opportunity to share key provisions on FEMA regulations and my understanding about these regulations with all of you. So with this, definitely I take the pleasure and my privilege to start the session. One minute, I'll just connect the presentation. Hope all of you can see it. Mangesh, it's visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, perfect. So in our today's session, we are going to talk about the key provisions under FEMA, especially in relation to foreign direct investment and overseas direct investment. Now, before we talk about these specific product or specific transactions, let's just speak about the background about FEMA and FERA. Now, in present day world, or let's say from India perspective, if we would have had Indian currency being used for any kind of transactions, definitely we would not have needed foreign currency or foreign exchange. Now, in present day world, we need to kind of do the purchase and sales of products within entities on persons or persons located across the geographies, or that is, you can say different countries. Then definitely settlement of those transactions need foreign exchange or foreign currencies. Now, from India perspective, it is FEMA, Foreign Exchange Management Act, which is to be followed or complied with. Now, the FEMA comes into effect effective June 2000 as a replacement of FERA. Prior to FEMA, it was FERA, which was in force, that was to be followed up by any entity or persons undertaking any kind of foreign exchange transactions. Now, as compared to FERA, FEMA is definitely a progressive law. It has been brought into existence post year 1991, when we had industrial revolutions going on, wherein the need was felt that the existing law FERA was not sufficient enough to provide enough framework or ease of doing business, or say liberalized policies with respect to foreign investments and trade from India. In order to ease out these restrictions on foreign exchange transactions, government brought in FEMA as a replacement of FERA. FEMA, as I said, is definitely a progressive law. It has come up with a lot of liberalization to AD banks to permit transactions, which they find, as per the documentation furnished by the corporates, as authentic and genuine transactions. AD banks can permit those transactions under FEMA. In case of FERA, the key difference was prima facie is that all kind of transactions were subject to RBI approval, which is not so in case of FEMA. What government or RBI has done is that there is a specific classification or concept which they have brought in, is that a transaction need to be classified either as a current account transaction or a capital account transaction. Now, AD banks have been permitted to allow all kind of current account transactions basis their satisfaction of the underlying transactions. If they find the transaction as genuine or bona fide, they can permit those transactions basis their review of underlying transaction documentations furnished by the company. But in case of capital account transactions, again, AD banks can permit if those transactions comply with the automatic route guidelines. Otherwise, those transactions require prior approval of RBI. So under FEMA, concept of current account transactions and capital account transactions has been brought in, which was not so in case of FERA. Now, the primarily objective of FERA was to regulate foreign exchange, because at that time, of course, we did not have the sufficient foreign exchange reserves, and hence appropriate need was to conserve foreign exchange. Whatever limited foreign exchange we had, idea was to kind of conserve those foreign exchange, not to spend without a specific purpose or benefit to the country. The FERA was there to ensure that foreign exchange is saved, is conserved. FEMA, as against this, was brought in order to facilitate trade and payment business and to attract more foreign investment to the country. With this background, I will give some background or brief about the current law and the various regulatory guidelines which need to be followed. And then we can specifically talk about the key provisions related to foreign direct investment, FDI, and overseas direct investment from India, the ODI. Now, whenever we have to apply foreign exchange guideline for any kind of transactions, these are the various, you can say, the FEMA Act as well as the supporting guidelines which need to be referred to. FEMA Act, the principal law itself. FEMA notifications are the various notifications issued by RBI from time to time. Then the EPDR circulars issued by RBI, FDI policy and the NDI rules with respect to foreign investment into the country. Then FEMA rules issued by government. AD conferences minutes issued by RBI, which is their discussion with various AD, with across AD banks on the queries raised to RBI by the AD banks. So minutes of those conferences are circulated by RBI every year. Those minutes are also to be referred while handling any kind of transactions. And FDI guidelines, of course. FDI basically issues operational instructions to all the AD banks to follow while undertaking any kind of foreign exchange transactions. So all these regulatory references I have noted here, which are applicable while handling any kind of foreign exchange transaction. Now, as I said, FEMA has the concept of capital account transaction and current account transaction. Now, before applying any guideline specifically to a particular transaction, we need to know whether the transaction is a current account transaction or whether it's a capital account transaction. The whole entire act applicability depends upon this classification. Once we have classified a transaction into a capital account transaction, then yes, next step is to apply the respective guideline. Now, in FEMA, definitely a very specific definition is given for capital account transaction. A transaction which alters the assets and liabilities abroad in case of a person resident in India, or a transaction which alters the assets and liabilities in India of a person resident outside India is a capital account transaction. Now, say for example, let's say an Indian entity is looking at investing into the equity of an overseas company. So it creates an asset for the Indian entity, and hence it's a capital account transaction. Similarly, let's say Indian company gets an overseas company to invest into the shares of the Indian company. That is FDI. So from non-resident entity perspective, it's an investment or the asset they create in India, and hence it's a capital account transaction. Take another case where let's say an Indian entity wants to export goods outside and receive the foreign exchange as settlement of the export transaction. Here, there is no asset liability being created. It's just like against supply of the goods, Indian company receives the settlement proceeds, the export proceeds. So it's a current account transaction because there is no asset or liability being created. Rather, it's a plain supply of goods or services and receiving the foreign exchange against those goods or services. So it's a current account transaction. So very important that any transaction being undertaken between entities, this definition is referred to, and accordingly the respective guideline is applied. So I have noted here few examples like overseas direct investment, as I mentioned. Consultancy services could be another example where let's say an Indian entity avails some services from an overseas company and has to make a payment towards those services. So it would be a current account transaction because there is no asset or liability being created. Rather, it is a payment, the foreign exchange outlay against the services received by the Indian entity. So it's a current account transaction. Now, for any NR entity to do business in India, we see that there are two options. One is kind of a office setup. An overseas company can come to India and set up an office in India, either as a branch office or a license office or a project office. They can have a presence in India and do the business in India. If it's a purely a business, then it's branch office. If it is just a licensing work, a representative office kind of setup, then it's a license office. Or if they have secured a project from an Indian entity, then it's a project office setup.
पर टमाटर आया था।
Another way to come to India is by way of a subsidiary setup, which is FDI, wherein the NR entity makes an investment into the equity of the Indian company, and thus it's an FDI into India. So that way an NR entity can come to India either as a branch office or a liaison office or a project office setup, or as a subsidiary investment into India as an FDI. There is no third category other than these two for an NR entity to come and do business into India. With this brief background, we shall touch upon to discuss the key provisions related to foreign direct investment into India. While I have tried to touch upon the key points in relation to these guidelines, FDI and ODI, I request in case you have any queries, please post the same in the chat box and we can take up those queries as well. I mean, as we go along, if you see any queries in relation to those topics or anything that comes to mind, please feel free to post on the chat box and we can take up those questions. Now, from foreign investment into India, the key provisions which I have noted here, these are the key ones which one needs to be aware of while handling any kind of foreign direct investment related transactions that we will be covering in all our entire discussion. Entry route. In case of FDI, we need to see whether the entry is under automatic route or is under approval route. So whenever, let's say, an overseas company is looking at investing into any particular segment, we need to see in the FDI policy whether that segment is under automatic route or under approval route, and accordingly to take next steps to permit that transaction. When we say approval route, that means it will require prior approval of the respective ministry of the government. If it is under automatic route, then no prior approval is required. It is already approved segment from government, and yes, banks can permit FDI transaction into their segment. Sectoral caps, there are some segments where specific caps are there beyond which FDI is not allowed, or up to which in those segments FDI is allowed. However, of course, we have to see whether the entry route is automatic route or approval route, and accordingly FDI is permitted up to that much percentage. Now, who is eligible to invest? A non-resident entity except direct or indirect FDI from land border countries is eligible to do investment into India. So you can say any non-resident is permitted to invest into India except those who are from land border countries. It's a very special amendment which has been done in April 2020 this year that we'll shall cover in detail in the subsequent slide. Next, who can be eligible investee entity? Indian company or registered LLP are the only two eligible entities who can receive FDI under automatic route. Rest all entities like proprietorship firm or partnership firm which is unregistered or any other setup, if they want to receive foreign funding, they have to have prior approval of RBI. Now, pricing guidelines, which is a fair valuation criteria, also need to be complied with. FDI linked performance condition. Now, in some of the segments in the FDI policy, there are some specific conditions which are laid down that also need to be complied with throughout the life cycle of that FDI investment. For the specific segment, we need to make a reference to the particular provisions in the FDI policy and comply with those conditions. For example, FDI is allowed in single brand equity, 100% FDI is allowed under automatic route in single brand retail trading. However, condition is that there has to be local sourcing of the products sold up to at least 30%. I mean, the entity which is receiving the FDI for engagement in single brand retail trading, they have to ensure that they do local sourcing of at least 30% of their production. If they do not comply with this condition, then then it's a non-compliance and they cannot continue that FDI investment. So that way, for respective sectors, there are separate conditions laid down by government in the FDI policy. Similarly, lock-in period is there. For few of the segments, there are lock-in period specified by government, and investment is not allowed to be exited in case that lock-in period is not over. So for example, once an investment has been done and if the lock-in period is, let's say, 3 years, then overseas investor cannot exit before 3 years. Eligible instrument against the particular investment, the overseas investor definitely gets some certificate of investment. In the sense, could be equity instrument, or could be CCPS or CCDS, compulsory convertible preference shares, or compulsory convertible debentures, or convertible notes, or units of investment vehicle. These are the only instruments which can be issued to the overseas investor. Then there are certain segments which are prohibited for receiving FDI. We shall discuss few of these in detail in the subsequent slides. Now, I noted the entry route and the sectoral cap related points. So here, just as an example, not a complete extract, but examples of few business segments I have noted here. You see that segment like agricultural and animal husbandry, plantation, mining, 100% FDI is allowed under automatic route. Print media, 26% FDI is allowed. That too is under government route. So you need prior approval, and with approval also you can get FDI only up to 26%. Beyond that, anyways, it will require government approval. Pharma sector, again, it could be two categories: greenfield investment or a brownfield investment. If it is greenfield, then under automatic route you can have 100% FDI. If it is brownfield investment, you can have 74% under automatic route. Beyond 74%, it will be under approval route. Now, what is greenfield and what is brownfield? Greenfield basically would mean where, let's say, the overseas entity sets up the entity in India from scratch. I mean, they do all business analysis, they carry out all the research, and they give birth to the Indian entity to carry out that particular business in pharma sector. Then yes, it's a greenfield. If they acquire an existing setup where, let's say, some Indian company has set up the business, and then some NR entity comes forward and wants to buy out a stake in that existing setup, that is called as brownfield, in which case FDI is restricted to 74% under automatic route. Beyond that, it will require government approval. So you can have 100% FDI, however, entry route up to 74% is under automatic. Beyond that, it is under approval route. So that way, for all the segments, we have to study the FDI policy and see how much is the percentage the sectoral cap is specified, and how much is the what is the entry route available for that particular investment. Now, the specific regulation which I mentioned in terms of who can invest into India. Now, recently, April this year, government has amended the law wherein they have provided that entity or the investor from land border sharing countries will be under government approval. The FDI coming in from land border countries will be under approval route. So there are 7 countries where we share the land border. All those 7 countries, if they invest into India, it will be under approval route. Now, not only the direct investment from these countries, even the indirect investment is also under approval route. When we say indirect investment, basically it means that, let's say, the direct investment is from US. Now, the US entity is in turn held by any of these countries. Then it's an indirect investment from land border countries. So even that is also under approval route. So direct FDI as well as indirect FDI from land border sharing countries will require prior approval of the respective ministry. Now here, while government has issued the guideline, they have not mentioned the names of the specific countries. They have simply mentioned that countries sharing land border with India, FDI is under approval route. Now, what about investment coming in from Hong Kong, Macau, or Taiwan? That is not clarified yet. So view or the market practice here is that if any such investment is coming from any of these countries, that is also considered under approval route. Reason being, Hong Kong is under China administration, and similar the debatable issue is there with respect to Macau and Taiwan. So it's not just about, say, countries which are exactly sharing the land border, but also these Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, which are kind of having China administration controlling them, that is also under approval route. So investment coming in directly or indirectly from any of these countries is under approval route. Next, the gray area or the point which still require further clarification is in terms of what is the meaning of beneficial ownership. I mean, if the investment is coming from any of these countries, that means the beneficial ownership is residing in these countries. So now, how much limit do we have to see? Let's say investment is coming in from, say, US, and US has 1% stake held by, US entity has 1% stake held by any of these land bordering countries. So will that 1% holding by any of these countries will make the transaction under approval route? So that percentage limit is not clarified yet. So as a kind of market practice, it is kind of even one share, forget 1%, even one share held by any of these countries shareholder, then it will be under approval route. Reason being, in the regulation, nowhere government has clarified what is the meaning of beneficial ownership. Now, recently there have been news items wherein it is being proposed to the government to allow such transactions wherever the beneficial ownership is up to 25%. So anything anything more than 25% should only be under approval route. However, it is only an item under discussion as of now. Nothing finalized. No direction or instruction has come in from the government. So till it is clarified, even one share held by any of these land bordering countries, directly or indirectly, the transaction is under approval route. So now with this, there are almost more than 100 deals, 100 applications are still in process with RBI or the government for review and deciding on whether to give the approval or not. Basically, the respective ministries are still reviewing those transactions, and FDI proposals are yet to be cleared. Feel free to raise any questions as you see around these topics in the chat box, and we shall take up those questions as well. Now, next point which I mentioned important or relevant is that few of the sectors which are prohibited for FDI, these are the sectors which are mentioned in the NDI rules or the FDI policy itself, quite self-explanatory. FDI is not permissible in any of these segments, even under approval route. No need of approaching government seeking approval, because these are mentioned in the guideline itself as sectors which are prohibited for receiving foreign investment. So there is no need of going to government even seeking approval. These are straight away prohibited for receiving FDI. Next, the pricing guidelines, the valuation certification of the shares of the receiving Indian entity or the LLP. Indian entity could be LLP or a company. Now, what I have done is that I have classified the pricing guidelines into two categories. One, at the time of issuance of shares, the primary transaction, or second, at the time of transfer of existing stake in the investee entity by the shareholders. Now, again, there could be two situations. One is unlisted company or a listed company. Now, a situation where company is looking for issuance of shares and it's an unlisted company. So it could be an FDI by way of subscription to the MOA. Let's say the overseas investors come together and they form the company and they incorporate the company, subscribe to the MOA, and then do the funding into the bank account of the Indian company. It would be a FDI by way of subscription to MOA. So definitely, since company itself is not in existence prior to being in, so no need of a separate valuation certification. In case of subsequent investment, fair value certified by the CA or a cost accountant or a merchant banker is sufficient. In the sense, the CA, cost accountant, or the merchant banker has to certify the fair value, and Indian entity issuing the shares has to make sure that shares are issued at a price more than the fair value certified by the valuer. Also, the valuation method adopted by CA or the cost accountant or the SEBI registered merchant banker has to be necessarily an internationally accepted valuation method. Also, it must indicate that valuation has been done on an arm's length basis. Many times, practically, we see situations where the valuer does not indicate whether the method followed is an internationally accepted valuation method or not. Or we also see cases where the wording that valuation has been done on an arm's length basis is not mentioned. In those cases, such kind of valuation certificates are not acceptable. Reason being, government has clearly laid down in the NDI rules that method followed has to be clearly indicated in the certificate. But I mean, many times we see that say the correspondent or the merger, the valuer, they believe that the company where let's say the Indian entity has come out with a right issue and issues shares to the existing shareholder. In that case also valuation requirement is there. However, the pricing needs to be complying with the specific provision mentioned in the guideline, which says that the price at which the shares are issued to the NR investor has to be equal to or more than the price which is offered to the resident shareholder. If that is ensured, then company can go ahead with the right issuance. So that way there is no need of a separate valuation. The valuation requirement is justified if company can confirm that this is the price at which the shares have been issued to the resident shareholder. Anything equal to or more than that should also be charged to the NR investor. I mean, it should not happen that shares have been issued to the NR investor at a price less than the price which is offered to the resident shareholder. So that's the only rule in case of right issuance. Now there could be one situation, let's say there is renunciation of right in favor of a non-resident entity by a resident shareholder. Now resident, let's say, does not go for further investing under the right. Rather, resident shareholder renunciates the right in favor of another non-resident. In which case, yes, pricing guideline would be applicable, because from India perspective, then it's a FDI coming in from a non-resident who earlier did not have entitlement to invest on a right basis, rather who gets the entitlement of right by buying out from a existing resident shareholder under renunciation. So in that case, yes, pricing valuation criteria, pricing guideline would need to be complied with, and hence the valuation from a CA, cost accountant, or a merchant banker is required. Now next, in case of a listed company. Now in listed companies, as long as SEBI guidelines are followed, there is no need of a separate valuation. Valuation need to conform to the SEBI guidelines. The same, I mean, indicated in the prospectus or offer document would suffice the requirement. So AD banks will not call or ask for a separate valuation as long as prospectus, the offer documents complying with SEBI guidelines have been shared with the bank. Now, second category, in case of transfer situations, there could be transfer of shares from existing resident shareholder to a non-resident and vice versa. In those situations, again, whether it's an unlisted company or a listed company. If it is unlisted company, then yes, CA, cost accountant, or a merchant banker has to certify the fair market value. Now, if it is a case where, let's say, resident is selling its stake to a non-resident, then this needs to be ensured that the price which is offered or at which the sale happens to the NR is more than the fair value as certified by the valuer. If it is a situation where, let's say, the resident entity is buying out from the existing non-resident shareholder, in which case there would be an outflow of funds, and hence the price at which the purchase happens by the resident, that price should be less than the fair value certified by the valuer. So we need to see that fair value criteria is complied with. Fair value as indicated by the CA, cost accountant, or the merchant banker. Again, the valuer has to indicate that valuation has been done on an arm's length basis, on following the internationally accepted valuation method, and the manner of arriving the valuation is indicated in the valuation certificate. In case of valuation by CA, UDI number is of course must. The same should also be indicated or printed on the certificate. Now, transfer situation, but a listed company case. Now again, we have to see whether the transfer is happening on the stock exchange or whether it is happening off the market. If it is online on the stock exchange, then the price as indicated in the broker note is sufficient, because the broker note would indicate the price at which the trade has happened. So no separate documentation is required. If it is a off the stock exchange deal like book building, IPO, block deals, delisting, etc., in those cases, of course, a CA certificate is required certifying pricing to have been complied with as per the applicable SEBI guidelines. Now, what are the respective SEBI guidelines? That would depend upon the type of deal which has happened, and accordingly the CA would need to indicate the manner and the fact that pricing as laid down by SEBI has been complied with. That certificate, of course, is required to be updated or uploaded in the FCTRS reporting on the SMF portal to RBI. We shall discuss about the reporting requirements in the subsequent slides. So along with the reporting, these certifications are required. Now, what we have discussed is in connection with the company. There could be a second setup, which is LLP. Now, if the LLP is the receiving entity, then of course a valuation certificate is applicable in case of LLP as well. Now, in case of LLP, even though it's a issuance case or it's a transfer case, in both the situation, the CA or the cost accountant or the merchant banker has to do the valuation. I mean, so you see the difference in case of LLP if it is a fresh issuance. But if it is a company and it's a fresh issuance, in case of LLP, valuation is required. In case of company, valuation is not required if the investment is happening basis the MOA by the subscriber to the MOA. But in case of LLP, the partners cannot just agree in the LLP agreement and they invest at a particular amount without having the valuation in place. So let's say following the DCF method, at least they can still do the valuation, but valuation is must in case of LLP. Mangesh, do we want to take some questions? If any has come in the chat box.
Hello, there are some questions in the chat box, if you can take them.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just opening that. Yeah, so whether 80 minutes available for public to read. So 80 minutes are not made available on the website. These are actually shared with the banks only. Banks are mandated to follow those 80 conference minutes as well. At times, banks can share the relevant extract of those minutes as and when required by the clients. So I agree with you. It's not available on RBI site for public to follow. Next, are indemnity payments capital account or current account transactions? So here, I mean, unless the purpose is clarified, I will not be able to comment whether it's a capital account or current account. Normally, indemnity payments structures I have seen in connection with share purchase transactions, where in case of transfer of shares, some amount is agreed to be paid out later. So definitely it's a capital account transaction. If it is in connection with an underlying share purchase transaction, then yes, it's a capital account transaction. Next question in the chat box, is there any cap of foreign donation to NGO having FCRA? Foreign donations to NGO having FCRA. So, I mean, FCRA, when we say it's like incoming remittances coming into the FCRA account, that is very much allowed, provided FCRA holds an approval from the ministry. Now, a reverse situation where you are looking at doing foreign donation to outside India, because very is not clear whether it is for incoming donation or outgoing donation. In case of incoming donation received by FCRA, if FCRA is registered with MHA, they can receive inward remittance, provided they receive it in the account held with SBI. Recently, there has been amendment in the FCRA regulation, and FCRA inward remittance can be received only in the account maintained with SBI. In case of outward donation, there is no permission as such to make out donation except 3 permitted category in the Schedule 3. Schedule 3 of current account transactions rules covers some 3 specific scenarios where donations are permitted. Other than that, there is no permission for donation under automatic route. I mean, for outward remittances. Next question is, can you please discuss NCD subscription by overseas entity? So NCD NCD basically is a non-FDI instrument. Non-convertible debentures is something not covered by FDI. It would be covered under ECB regulation. So, I mean, of course, it has its own features and all that. I think maybe we can cover up in the next session if I get the opportunity to do similar sessions in future. Definitely, I note of this. You have any specific queries, you can connect with me post the session, and I shall understand and happy to address a specific query. But yeah, as a rule, NCD are governed by the ECB regulation, and of course, not an eligible FDI instrument or equity instrument. Next, is foreign company allowed to invest in agricultural land under agricultural and animal husbandry? Yeah, so agricultural, as I mentioned, this is one of the segment where under automatic route, they have permitted FDI investment. Now, purchase of agricultural land is not allowed. They can only invest into a company that is doing business into that particular segment. But directly purchasing the agricultural land is not allowed. They can invest into the equity of the company which is into agricultural activity. So investing into the equity is allowed, but not owning the agricultural land directly. So that's not allowed. Has anyone received FDI approval for China? As of now, I have not seen a single case. While I know this is some news articles in the AT that there are some 100+ applications which are pending with government for review and approval. But as of now, I have not seen any single case being approved. Is unlisted company, the shareholders are only non-resident shareholder. In unlisted company, the shareholders are only non-resident shareholder, whether valuation certificate is to be obtained. Yeah, so I think you are talking about the right issue case here. In case of right issuance, if there is a resident shareholder, then yes, I have mentioned about the requirement. So if there is no resident shareholder, here views are divided. Logically, it is not required because guideline does not mention about this, but we have seen some of the regional offices of RBI asking for the valuation certificate. I mean, guideline is a bit not clear here. At times we have seen regional offices of RBI asking for it. So subsequently, then this needs to be given. But as a rule, as per clear interpretation of the guideline, it is not required. How older valuation certificate is acceptable for FDI? Now, the valuation certificate, of course, as per the guideline, has to be as of the transaction time. Now, let's say if you are doing the transaction, let's say on 25th of November, the valuation certificate also has to be around this time only. So a reasonable time could be a week, or say 2 weeks or 1 month at best. Some banks are permitting even up to 6 months. Our point here is that the requirement is that fair value needs to be certified. Now, if we say that valuation is, let's say, 1 year older, how are we satisfying ourselves that valuation has been done on a fair value basis? So the company receiving the foreign investment has to justify that the valuation, if it is say 1 year or 2 year older, it indicates the fair value. So very important that transaction level certification is there. It cannot be a valuation certificate older than say 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months at the best. Beyond that, there would be more questions or expectations from the company to clarify how they have received the FDI and issued shares to an entity at a price which is fair value as of the transaction time. I mean, it should not happen that if they use, let's say, 6 months or 1 year older certificate, and fair value at the time of transaction has undergone a change, right? So if there are events which have occurred after the initial valuation, which has a material impact on the price of the shares of the company, it can have impact from a regulation perspective. So it has to be as nearest as the date of transaction. From guideline perspective, of course, there is no timeline given here. It has to be of the transaction time only. Okay, so I think I have taken all the questions on the chat box as of now. We shall move on. Okay, so in the next slide, we will talk about the eligible instruments which are available, which can be issued to the non-resident investors. One is non-debt instruments, or the debt instrument, the two concept or the two classifications which are there, that needs to be well known to arrive at the applicable guideline in terms of which instrument being issued to the overseas investor and how the guideline is being complied with. So in NDI, the non-debt instrument rules, the definition which is given is of non-debt instrument. Anything other than NDI is a debt instrument by default. Now, what is non-debt instrument? It includes all your equity investments, equity instruments, which was the definition earlier also during FEMA 20 revised in 2017, in November 2017. The same definition is carried forward here. Basically, so NDI includes the equity instrument. Equity instrument again has four components: equity shares, CCPS, and CCD, and share warrants. Now, in case of CCPS, if these are NCP or OCP, in case of preference shares, I mean, if these are NCP or OCP but issued before April 2007, then these would be viewed as equity instrument. Post April 2007, NCP and OCPs were to be viewed as ECB, were to be under ECB. Similarly, for debentures, if it is CCD, if it is compulsory convertible debentures, then it is an eligible equity instrument. If it is NCD or OCD, June 2007, then yes, it is an eligible equity instrument. But if it is issued after June 2007, then it is to follow ECB guidelines. So that way you can say under NDI, one is equity instrument. Second, capital contributions in case of LLP. Third, or I think till serial number Roman letter 9, all these are newly added instrument types wherein existing provisions RBI has or the government has clubbed together. Like you can say earlier it was investment vehicle, units of investment vehicle, that is also now part of equity instrument, this NDI definition. Similarly, acquisition, sale and dealing directly in immovable property. That immovable property also is now clubbed as a part of NDI, non-debt instrument. So whatever investment which can come in from the foreign entity is either an NDI or a debt instrument. So all these are NDI which are mentioned here. Other than these are all debt instrument. So that's the simple definition government has given here. But from a guideline perspective, there is no substantial change. One minute, I will move to the next slide. Yeah, next is convertible note. Now, convertible note is again an instrument available to overseas investors which can be issued. Now, it's a basically it's very specific instrument that comes with features of debt instrument being made available to the overseas investor. Now, from an startup perspective, it's a very, very, very good instrument available to them. Reason being, overseas investors, while investing into startups, many times like they may not feel good as investing by taking, because they will not know in terms of whether that startup is worth investment, whether they should be doing that investment. So to ensure that they do not end up taking equity risk, they are given this convertible note which they can invest and fund the startup. If the startup grows and do well, then they can convert the instrument into an equity. So convertible note basically is a debt instrument that carries the features of debt, features of equity in a way that holder gets the option to either claim the repayment or opt for the issuance of the equity. Again, it is available only to startups which are registered with DIPP. I mean, it is not available to every startup. Only the registered startups which is registered with DPIIT can get these kind of convertible notes. Next, it comes with a minimum holding criteria that it needs to be decided within 5 years whether a repayment is required or whether a conversion is required. So within 5 years, the holder has to decide either for repayment of the debt or for continuing by becoming an equity shareholder. Anything beyond 5 years will require prior approval of RBI. For issuing any such kind of instrument, the startup entity has to do a reporting to RBI in Form CN, convertible note, within 30 days of receiving the investment. So these are the basic conditions which the startup registered with DPIIT should comply with. And investor from investor's perspective, actually it's a good instrument which is available because it helps him avoid the equity risk. Now in this page I have just summarized here the key regulation with respect to FDI, the key terms. Few of this we have already discussed, like various instruments, the pricing guidelines, sectoral cap, KYC. KYC is something where this is more of an operational matter. The overseas investor or the remitter, whoever has sent or invested the money, Indian company needs to furnish KYC of that investor to the AD bank while reporting the FCGPR to RBI. Now this KYC information has to come from the overseas bank via Swift message, via authenticated Swift message, giving the 6-pointer information as required by RBI. I mean, RBI has given a prescribed format of the KYC, in that only it has to come. Now, many times we see practical challenges here that overseas investor does not have a bank account and hence money was sent by a different entity called remitter. So a situation where, let's say, sender of money is different entity and then the one who gets the shares. So if there is difference between investor and remitter, then KYC of both the entities is required. That's one. Second, you cannot have a situation where, let's say, investor has sent the money and investor does not maintain a bank account with any bank overseas, because that is something not acceptable in the present day world, that some entity who is doing FDI and is not having bank account. So these kind of explanations are not okay with RBI. RBI mandates that bank account is mandatory for every investor, and KYC thus has to come from the overseas bank for both the investor as well as remitter. Now, from a reporting perspective, whenever the Indian company has received FDI, they have to report FCGPR within 30 days of issuing the equity instrument to the overseas investor. And equity instrument must be issued within 60 days. So in total, you can say a timeline is 90 days for entire transaction to complete. Within 60 days, equity instrument should be issued, and within 30 days of issuing the equity instrument, the FCGPR reporting should be completed. Now, in case of transfer situation, the timeline which I mentioned is more in case of issuance, is more relevant in case of issuance transaction. Now, if there is transfer of shares by the existing shareholder to another non-resident and vice versa, in those situations, Form FCTRS is applicable. Now, that FCTRS filing should be completed within 60 days. Now, here one important point here is that without completion of FCTRS reporting, investee companies should not take on record the new entity as shareholder and delete the name of existing one. I mean, without having FCTRS duly certified by the AD bank, Indian investee company should not take on record the new entity as its shareholder. Many times we have seen cases where, let's say, investee company has already registered the new entity as its shareholder, and the parties to the transaction have not got the FCTRS submission done to the AD bank, in which case it's a purely a non-compliance of the guidelines. Now, reason being why this kind of catch here, why that Indian company is not allowed to take on record transfer of shares. Reason being, if the Indian company is allowed to do so without having FCTRS being in place, then it's like none of the parties to the transaction will come forward and do this reporting. See, they can simply sell out the shares, get the inward remittance to their account and exit the investment, and the new NR will request the Indian company to take him on record. And Indian company also takes the new NR investor on record as his shareholder. Now, what happens if there is any pre-existing non-compliance? Nothing will get to the attention of RBI. Now, for example, let's say a resident entity has bought the stake from an NR entity, and resident entity makes out an outward remittance to the NR entity, and NR entity exit out of the shareholding. I mean, NR entity who had made some earlier FDI, he sold out that stock to the resident, and resident makes an outward remittance. Now, the Indian company, let's say, takes the new NR out of its book and take the resident on record of the Indian company. And Indian company, let's say, never reported their transaction to RBI initially when NR had invested. Then previous irregularity would never get to the attention of the regulator. Or to explain it in simple terms, let's say there is an FDI which is not reported to RBI. Now that NR shareholder sells out its holding to a resident, receives his money, and exit the investment. So that way, if FCTRS reporting is not filed and Indian company does not insist for the FCTRS reporting, then previous irregularity, if any, would never come to the knowledge of the banks. So that's very important that FCTRS reporting is done and companies take on record only after FCTRS has been completed. Next, FDI registration number allotted by RBI for the initial investment is very important in case of bonus and right issue. I mean, let's say an NR entity has invested into the Indian company and Indian company subsequently does a bonus issue or a right issue. Then banks, while updating their right issue reporting or while allowing the fund flow for right issue, banks will ask for the FDI registration number for the previous investment, because bonus issue or right issue is something is available only to the existing shareholder. So that means company should have completed the FCGPR reporting for the previous investment. If company has not completed the FCGPR reporting for the previous investment, and if they are allowed to do the right issue or the bonus issue, then it's a kind of ignoring the non-compliance which is existing and allowing the future transaction. So bonus or right issue will not be allowed if they do not have the FDI registration number for the existing FDI. Similarly, transfer of shares from non-resident to resident will be allowed only if FDI registration number for the previous investment is in place. 7th point I discussed. Then timelines we have discussed. Here I have noted few case studies just to understand this concept of FDI more in detail with more clarity. Okay, first point, KYC, where investor is different from overseas remitter of funds. So while this is permitted in case of an Indian company where you can have a remitter entity which is different from the investor who will get the shares, but again KYC of the remitter as well as investor both is required, along with an NOC from the remitting entity. That remitting entity does not have any objection if the shares are issued to a different entity, because it's remitting entity's funds. So ideally a KYC NOC is also required, wherein remitter has to give his no objection. Next, this relaxation of remitter being different from the investor is not available or permissible for LLP. In case of LLP, the person who sends the money only has to become the partner. I mean, you cannot have someone else becoming the partner where the funds have been sent by some other entity. So in case of LLP, both the remitter or investor have to be one and the same entity only. So you can say there is no concept of remitter and investor being different. Next, is there any timeline for return of funds in case of resident seller of shares having received the funds for sale of shares and later on sale does not happen? So a situation where, let's say, the Indian entity has received the sale proceeds for transfer of shares and subsequently for some reason, let's say, deal gets cancelled, right? So this kind of situation will require prior approval of RBI. Reason being, there is no concept of receiving advance by an Indian seller towards sale of shares. Advance concept is only in case of export, where you can receive advance and do the export shipment within 1 year. But in case of equity instrument transfer, you need to ensure that you receive the sale consideration only if the deal is fully signed off. You cannot have a situation give us deal is cancelled and now you cannot go ahead with this, and hence you need to return the funds. To return the funds, it will require RBI approval. Now, next question is treatment of holding by resident nominee while beneficial holding stays with the non-resident. Now, many times to meet the Companies Act requirement, we have seen cases where, let's say, one resident entity is introduced as a nominee. So that is perfectly fine. You can have the resident entity as nominee. However, from a foreign investment perspective, the entire investment which came in from the NR will be reported as a foreign investment. Valuation certificate up to what period is acceptable, that we have discussed. Okay, next also we have discussed. Can a foreign investor invest in rights shares issued by Indian company at a discount? So in case of rights shares, we have discussed that valuation certificate as such is not required, but some of the regional offices of RBI sometimes ask for it. So answer is yes, separate valuation is not required in case of right issue. But in case of listed company or unlisted company, again, regulation is different. What we discussed was more in context of unlisted companies, And in case of listed companies, at a price as may be determined by the company following the SEBI guidelines, they can do so. So yes, it can be at a discount, but again, the point about valuation being gray, many times some regional offices ask for the fair value. So this point is really gray. On a case-to-case basis, it should be discussed and handled accordingly. In case parties are really looking for issuing shares at a discount than fair value. Practically, views are different, but theoretically, yes, it is doable. But practically, on a case-to-case basis, we have seen different regional offices asking for valuation certificate. Next question, whether extension of compulsory convertible preference shares or CCD will require RBI approval. So many times we see that, let's say CCPS has been issued with a maturity of 5 years. Now let's say companies want to extend the maturity in agreement with the shareholder. Then yes, it is doable as long as it is in compliance with the Companies Act requirement. Under FEMA, RBI or the banks do not have any objection. And following the company secretary certification, confirming that Companies Act provisions have been complied with, AD banks can permit and take on record the revised maturity. Now next, whether any approval is required for an entity which has received foreign investment under automatic route and subsequently the sector is brought under approval route. Now that will not be required because we have to see the approval requirement at the time of initial investment. So initially, if it was under automatic route, then existing investment will not be impacted. However, any future receipt of FDI will be under approval route. Next, when to calculate foreign investment in the Indian company in case of ESOP. Many times Indian companies offers ESOP to overseas employees of its subsidiaries. So how to calculate the percentage holding in the company to comply with the sectoral cap requirement. So we need to do the calculation such that ESOP, let's say, is converted on that particular date, then how much is the percentage held by the overseas investor or the employee. So equivalent converted ESOP we have to consider so that we know the exact equity capital in the company. So at the time of grant itself, this is relevant, not at the time of say vesting or exercise subsequently, say after 3 years, 5 years when employee will be vested with the ESOP. At that time we should calculate, no. We have to calculate the sectoral cap eligibility at the time of grant of ESOP itself. Now next, in case of issuing convertible note, whether valuation of equity is required upfront or at the time of conversion. Now we discuss in case of startups, the convertible note is another option which is available. So definitely here valuation of equity is required at the time of conversion and not at the time of issuing the debt instrument. Reason being, it's a debt instrument and it's an optionally convertible debt instrument. If it is compulsorily convertible, then yes, valuation is required on day one itself, valuation of equity. But in case of optionally convertible notes being a debt instrument, it is required at the time of conversion subsequently. Next, is a non-resident permitted to acquire shares on stock exchange? So yes, non-resident can invest into Indian listed companies in some 3 categories. So there could be FPI or FIIs which are registered with SEBI. They can invest. NRIs can invest. Next is a non-resident who acquired shares under this SEBI SAST guideline and is already holding that stake under SAST guideline can invest directly on stock exchange. So under these 3 categories, these investments from non-residents on stock exchange is allowed. What are the permissible modes for payment for acquiring shares of Indian entities? These are the few modes which I have mentioned here. Other than that, there is no other permissible method of investment. So you can say FDI by way of cash, foreign currency. Some, let's say, non-resident has visited India and wants to pay the cash, foreign currency dollars to the Indian entity and wants to get shares, then that's not a permissible method. Okay, so I think we have reached to the end of the presentation as long as this relates to foreign direct investment. Let's just see.
Can we take the questions in the chat box, sir?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just see the incremental questions which has come in for FDI. Okay, next question is KYC valid for 60 days? Now, from an RBI perspective, RBI has not mentioned anything in the guideline in terms of how old the KYC could be. So KYC is definitely required for every transaction as a rule. Now, again, different banks have different ways of deriving comfort on the KYC. Some banks have got written confirmation from RBI by way of discussion in the AD conference, or some banks have taken internal calls. Here, basically, my view is here that we can allow up to 60 days as long as we can ensure that second transaction where we want to refer to the previous KYC, that second transaction should also be flowing in from the same bank account from where the first FDI has come in. So as long as all the details are verifiable from the first transaction, then you can allow. Most important is the bank and the bank account. Otherwise, if the bank account is, let's say, different and investor is same, then in that case, it's not a sufficient compliance to say that we can use the same KYC. So, it should be discussed with the respective banks handling the transaction with the logic that if all the information are the same, then banks should allow those transactions under the same KYC. But again, it's a bank-to-bank call, and RBI has not given any clarity here. It is required for each transaction. Next, new subsidiary of a foreign company was incorporated. New subsidiary of a foreign company was incorporated. The foreign company has not remitted payment for subscription of shares for more than a year. If they want to remit the same now is valuation required. Company has not commenced business. The foreign company has not remitted payment for subscription of shares for more than a year. If they want to remit the same now, is valuation is required. So see, it is just like the company is formed and no investment has been done, right? So it's just like they have to kind of agree in the MOA that now everyone comes together and they invest. So it can still happen at the subscribed value, provided that there is no condition in the MOA with respect to the timelines that within which the investment should be made. I mean, I will take it as like company is just incorporated on paper, but there is no actual operations. There is no fund flow by resident or any non-resident, etc. So it is just like company name is registered, but there is no actual funding which has come in even from resident. So if no rupee has been invested by any of the investor or subscriber, then it's okay. Company need not go for valuation because the same rule need to be followed, and investors can invest at the subscriber price as per MOI. Next, is fair value criteria relevant for overseas direct investment? Yeah, that's again a very good question. From ODI guideline perspective, yes, we see in case of FDI fair value criteria is relevant, but in case of ODI, that we'll discuss in the next slide. But while valuation is required, you really don't have to compare the negotiated price versus the fair value price. It is up to the Indian company. If they see that there is a business opportunity in the overseas company being acquired, they can pay a bit higher price as well than what has been valued by CA. I mean, CA might believe that valuation of a company is, let's say, $1 million, but the Indian company believes that there is good business opportunity and they want to pay, say, 10% higher than what has been valued by CA. They are allowed to do so. So in case of ODI, yes, fair value criteria is not relevant. Next, what documents the company should keep from investment till the time of repatriation to non-resident? Okay, so I take it like throughout the life cycle of the foreign direct investment, what kind of documents should companies should keep till the time of repatriation? So especially the FDI registration number allotted by RBI should be preserved all times. Nowadays it is through SMA portal, wherein RBI, if it is within timelines, then AD Bank can accept the reporting, and auto email goes to the investee entity as well as to the bank, so that email which has FDI registration number, that should be preserved, and that is sufficient, along with the reporting reference numbers, etc. That should be preserved by the Indian investee company, because that number is very important. It would be relevant and asked by the banks if there is any subsequent exit by the NR. At that time, the repatriation will not be allowed if that FDI number is not in place. next question is, what is the procedure? Earlier Indian, then green card, US citizen, invest in stock market. So earlier Indian, then green card, US citizen. See, from FEMA perspective, we have to see whether he's a person resident in India or a person resident outside India. I mean, if he's a person resident outside India, then all the provisions which apply for a non-resident will apply him accordingly. So that's the, simple bifurcation which we have to follow. Same treatment as goes for a person resident outside India will be applicable here. Next, is there a need to have only one AD bank for getting inflow and outflow of foreign funds? So I take it as a query in relation to FDI. So in case of FDI, there is no concept of designated AD banks. You can have different AD banks handling each leg of your transaction. You can have let's say bank X to receive FDI, and you can have a bank Y to handle repatriation or subsequent transfer transaction. So you can have different banks for each of the transaction. So there is no designated AD bank concept, which is more relevant in case of ODI transaction, which we are going to cover in detail now. Okay, so I think we have reached to the last question in the chat box. Please feel free to add more, and we shall cover up each of those questions. Meantime, I shall start then ODI regulations. Okay. So overseas direct investment, as we see, it is kind of, just you can say a reverse of what we have discussed in FDI. Here in case of ODI, what happens is that Indian entity makes an investment into the equity of an overseas company. Now here, one important point which need to be considered here is whether the investment type is a strategic investment or whether it's a portfolio investment. This is that we need to apply the respective provisions. Before applying directly any documentation requirement or any specific procedure to be followed, we need to understand from the client company whether they are looking at doing a strategic investment or whether they are looking at doing a portfolio investment. Now, what is a strategic investment or what is portfolio investment? Again, that is not defined in the guideline. We need to understand this is the explanation being provided by the company itself and guide the company accordingly. Now, when we say that it's a portfolio investment, that means like how I and you investing, let's say, into few shares of say Amazon or Facebook or Google. Definitely our motive of investment is not to do business. Our motive is to hold those shares for some days or some months. When we see value appreciation, we'll exit and sell the holding. So in that case, it's a portfolio investment where motive is to just hold it for value appreciation, get the dividend and exit. Take another situation, a reverse scenario where let's say a company is investing with a view to doing business abroad. Their motive is to kind of expand their business in India, in their overseas geographies as well. They want to make business revenue, not simply by holding shares of the overseas company with a view to earning dividend. That's not the motive. That's the ultimate motive, but that's not the real motive. Real motive is to do business, make business revenue, and then receive it, of course, as a dividend back to the country. But their real motive is to do business. If the investment is done with a view to doing business abroad, then it's a overseas direct investment. It's an strategic investment. So that's one criteria to differentiate whether it's an ODI or whether it's a portfolio investment. This is the motive of the underlying investment. Second, there could be other supporting questions which could be put through to know whether it's an ODI or whether it's a portfolio. For example, Indian company goes and incorporates the overseas company by way of subscriber as a subscriber to MOA or AOA, or following the equivalent process like we have in India. Similarly, they also follow the process in the overseas country and they incorporate the company overseas. So definitely it's an ODI. In case of portfolio, normally company would already be in existence. Third point could be, let's say, Indian companies holding only a minuscule investment, minuscule stake in the overseas company, and they do not know or do not want to know, or they do not do business management of that overseas company. They are just holding the stake. They are not on the board of the company. They are not taking part in the business decision making process of the overseas company. They are just holding it for the sake of value appreciation. So if they are not on the board of the company, they do not take any business decision of the company, then again it could be a differentiating factor to decide whether it's an ODI or whether it's a portfolio. So this way, I mean, we need to find out what is the motive behind the investment to arrive at the conclusion whether it's an ODI or whether it's a portfolio. The definition which is given in the guideline is simple. It says that investment by an Indian party by way of purchase of equity shares of a foreign entity for promoting or extending business overseas is an ODI, excluding portfolio investment. Now, portfolio investment is simply excluded. Now, what is portfolio? That is not defined in the guideline. So again, we need to kind of understand which is the first part of the definition and exclude whatever is not covered in the first part. So let's say the motive which is not business oriented motive is to be excluded. Now, having concluded that yes, it's an ODI, next question comes in terms of what are the eligibility criteria, who can invest, what is the limit, whether any reporting requirements are there, etc. All those need to be then understood. Now, who can make ODI investment? A company or a registered partnership firm or an LLP or an individual. These all can make ODI. Now, individual can make ODI only under LRS limit, which is USD 250,000 per annum. But in case of company and registered partnership LLP, the limit is there, which is 4x of the net worth as of the last audited balance sheet, up to which they can do ODI. Or up to USD 1 billion in a financial year, whichever is less. So these two limits, one is yearly limit and one is cumulative limit, both to be complied with. So 400% or USD 1 billion in a particular financial year. This is the limit for companies and LLP. For individuals, it's LRS. Now, what are the various other conditions in terms of which is the segment in which the ODI is permissible? So here, unlike FDI, where we see that there is FDI policy, in case of ODI, there is no such separate policy, etc. You can invest in almost all the segment, except real estate sector and banking business. You want to incorporate a bank, of course, you need RBI permission. You cannot just go and incorporate a bank overseas. Similarly, you want to do an investment in a real estate sector, this will require RBI approval. Real estate, that means purchase and sale of properties abroad. If it is not purchase sale, then yes, real estate is also allowed. So again, it's a very, very technical term here. We need to really understand on a case-to-case basis to get our transaction coverage under automatic route. I mean, it should indeed be not a case of purchase and sale of properties. If it is a construction and then doing the selling, that is doable. But if it is simply purchase and sale, then it's a trading in real estate, that is not allowed. So other than this, all other sectors are doable. So real estate, trading in transferable development rights and banking business is something under approval route, you can say. Rest all sectors are under automatic route. As long as all other conditions of the automatic route are complied with, investment into these sectors are doable. Additionally, yes, of course, in case of financial investment transactions, approval of the respective sectorial regulator is also required. So it could be SEBI or could be RBI in case of NBFC. That approval is also required. Similarly, approval from the host country regulator is also required for the receiving country's regulator. I mean, if the investment is, let's say, goes to Singapore, then Singapore's RBI equivalent regulator who controls, who regulates the foreign exchange market there or the financial services market there, that regulator's approval is also required. So additional conditions are there in case of financial services ODI transactions. Other than that, there are certain other conditions as well, that first remittance has to be towards equity only. You cannot have, let's say, money being lent to a non-resident entity without you having equity stake in the overseas company. So as a rule, you can say that resident is not allowed to do lending to a non-resident. Or you can say resident can do a lending to a non-resident only if they have an equity stake in the NR entity. Similarly, Indian party I mean, similarly, in the sense, there are various other conditions also that also should be complied with. Indian party must not be on RBI's caution list of exporters. I mean, if the exporter has been caution listed, then such kind of exporters are not to be allowed ODI transaction because they have defaulted in realizing the export proceeds well in time. Then no reason to allow them to expand in overseas land and allowing them to take more exposure, because even the existing foreign exchange exposure which they have undertaken, they have not been able to bring in the export proceeds well in time. So those exporters who have defaulted are not allowed to undertake ODI transaction. Or the entities which are under investigations of any regulatory authority, they are also not allowed. Regulatory authority means any authority, could be say SEBI, could be an entity having under investigation by ED or some IRDA investigation. Any regulatory authority's investigation, if the company is undergoing, then they cannot do ODI under automatic route. Next condition is investment must be on a bona fide business abroad, must be to do a bona fide business abroad. Now, what is bona fide business? That is again not defined. We need to understand in terms of what is that company is looking at doing abroad, doing abroad in that investment, how they are going to make business revenue. Is it a real company or it is just like a company incorporated on paper? In the sense, for example, let's say a company has invested into a company in Dubai. Now that Dubai company has in turn brought in the money back as an FDI into India, right? So this kind of structure is definitely not a bona fide structure. Reason being, the FDI receiving entity could have been invested by the Indian company directly, rather than going to say Dubai and coming back as an FDI, right? This kind of structure is just a round tripping of funds. No way it's a bona fide structure, and hence it's not allowed. So business structure has to be a bona fide business structure. It should not be kind of a paper company. Should not be just an inoperative company. Should not be like they just they exist on paper and they do not have a real business being undertaken overseas. All the transactions, of course, of that particular entity must be carried on through a particular designated AD bank only. You cannot have, let's say, equity remittance done to the overseas entity from bank A, and then you use bank B for doing further remittance. Even bank B will not allow this. You need to route all your transactions through the same bank. That's one. Second, whenever the first transaction is done, the bank A will anyway report the transaction to RBI and will get the UIN number from RBI. So all subsequent transactions have to be done under the UIN received after doing the first transaction of equity. So these are the kind of basic transactions, basic automatic route compliances which need to be adhered to. From reporting perspective, on a yearly basis, APR filing needs to be done. Annual performance reporting needs to be submitted to RBI. That APR is must for all overseas investment. I mean, if the company, let's say, has more than one overseas companies, has ODI, let's say, in 5 countries, each of those investment has to be reported. And let's say company has five investment in the same country, then again 5 APRs for each of those investment entities is required. So APR across entities, across countries is required to be filed by the due date. Due date is December 31st every year for the respective financial year. Now, if APR is pending for any of the entity, then Indian entity is not eligible to do any further ODI for any of its other JVs also. So that's very, very important condition. It is just one filing in a year. That too, we have seen many cases where, let's say, companies have defaulted in ensuring the timelines. Or at times we have seen that companies do the filing much nearer to the due date. And later they face problems in terms of they being not able to have underlying supporting documents, etc. And this further delays the filing. So very, very relevant that I mean, we as practicing CAs or their CAs or the statutory auditors can guide the companies to adhere to the timeline and do the reporting well in time. Now, these are the few documents I have mentioned which are relevant or applicable from a ODI transaction perspective, which most banks ask for. Normally, banks have a declaration format, then auditor certificate certifying the 400% limit and other conditions with respect to automatic route eligibility. Valuation certificate here, as I discussed earlier, valuation certificate is required. However, there is no need of comparing the fair value with the negotiated price at which the investment happens. I mean, Indian company can very well pay something more than what the CA has certified However, Indian company would need to justify in terms of why they believe that the price which they wish to pay is something they believe that is they should be allowed to, and they believe that it will get them the business opportunities. Next, usual operational documents like Form ODI, project feasibility report, certificate of incorporation, board resolution, share purchase agreement, etc. are all required. One point which is certificate of incorporation of the overseas entity. Very important, because ODI is allowed only in incorporated entities. I mean, you cannot have an unincorporated entity where you want to invest and then subsequently, let's say, you get the shares of the unincorporated entity. So that is not allowed. Overseas entity has to be incorporated entity only. Now the investment which I mentioned, the 400% limit, is by way of financial commitment. When we say investment as equity, that's the very first remittance has to be towards equity only. Other than equity, what all things forms part of the financial commitment is something equity shares, of course, then CCPS, compulsory convertible preference shares, then normal preference shares like redeemable preference shares, which is at par with loan, or a normal loan, business loan to the overseas JV-BOS, or 100% of the amount of the corporate guarantee on behalf of its overseas JV-BOS. Next, 50% of the amount of performance guarantee issued on behalf of the overseas JV-BOS, and 100% of the bank guarantee issued by a resident bank on behalf of the overseas JV. So that way you can say that there could be 3-4 types of financial commitment: equity, CCPS, preference shares, loans, and this guarantee. Guarantee could be a corporate guarantee or a bank guarantee. Now, corporate guarantee is something which can be issued on behalf of its overseas JV-BOS, either a direct JV-BOS or a first level step-down subsidiary. Beyond that, corporate guarantee is not allowed. Now, let's say corporate guarantee is required for the second level or subsequent level, I mean second or subsequent, then it will be under approval route. I mean, under automatic route, it is not allowed. Similarly, in case of bank guarantee is allowed only on behalf of the direct JV-BOS. You cannot issue bank guarantee on behalf of this first level or subsequent step-down subsidiary. I mean, bank guarantee is restricted only on behalf of direct JV-BOS. Bank guarantee, when I say, it's basically kind of Indian company approaches here a bank in India to extend an SBLC to an overseas bank, and that overseas bank gives the credit facility to the direct JV-BOS of the Indian company. As a security, the SBLC is issued by the Indian companies favoring the overseas bank, and that overseas bank then is able to offer credit facilities to the direct JV-BOS. So issuing bank guarantee on behalf of, say, first level subsidiary, step-down subsidiary, or subsequent one is under approval rule. Here I have summarized the key obligations of the Indian party under ODI transactions. Now, after having done ODI, one is Indian companies under obligation to receive share certificates or any other evidence of investment in the foreign JV-BOS and submit the same to AD Bank within 6 months. So share certificate or the evidence of investment need to come, should be furnished to the AD Bank within 6 months of the investment. Default can or delay can cause penalty to the Indian entity. We have seen cases where Indian company has not been able to evidence the investment, and RBI has not taken it favorably. Indian companies under obligation to repatriate to India all the dues from the overseas JV-BOS, like dividend, royalty, anything accrues to the Indian company because of this ODI investment, that needs to be brought to India within 60 days. All the dues should be brought to India within 60 days. It must submit annual performance report for each of JV-BOS. As I discussed, it is required for all its investment. Next is Indian company is required to report post-investment changes like setting up of a subsidiary, change of nature of business, change of shareholding pattern, etc. within 30 days of they taking a decision of making the change. I mean, if the Indian company or the overseas company has decided to carry out some changes of their business nature of business activities, or let's say overseas company incorporates a subsidiary abroad, that all needs to be reported to the RBI within 30 days of the change, of the decision of change. In case of disinvestment, Indian company is required to repatriate the same to India within 90 days, the proceed of the disinvestment. There cannot be any delay here beyond 90 days. And to submit FLA report by July 15 every year. By July 15 every year, FLA reporting needs to be submitted. So these are the key obligations Indian company has to comply with. Here, I have noted some key studies in connection with ODI transactions. Now, can an Indian company convert loans into equity and vice versa? So yes, loans to equity is permissible, but not vice versa. In the sense, if the Indian company, let's say, has remitted some amount as loan to the overseas company, they are under obligation to receive it back. Now, let's say, just to save time in receiving it back and resending, RBI has allowed loan to be converted into equity, but reverse is not allowed. Now, in case of reverse, what happens is, let's say equity needs to be converted into loan. If you allow conversion of equity into loan, then what can happen is that eventually Indian company can not have any equity stake. Let's say entire equity they might end up converting into loan. In which case, what will happen is that they will end up owning the or rather not owning the the overseas entity as an equity shareholder. They will just end up having lent the overseas company if they convert entire equity into loan. That's one. Second, it is mentioned in the guideline that if there is any disinvestment, they need to bring in the proceeds within 90 days. Now, equity, if it is allowed to be converted into loan, then yes, it's a disinvestment, could be partially or fully, let's say. So whenever there is change in shareholding because of disinvestment, the proceed of disinvestment has to be brought to India within 90 days. So very clearly mentioned in the guideline that conversion of equity into loan is not allowed. Conversion of loan into equity is allowed. Only additional requirement would be that Indian entity will have to furnish a fresh valuation certificate as on the date when they do this change. Reason being, this needs to be known in terms of how much shares Indian company will be receiving subsequently. Again, fair value criteria is not applicable here, but still value needs to be assessed to see that it's not happen that Indian company does not receive at least proportionate share of the valuation. I mean, it could be nearer to the proportionate value, could be a bit less, but it should not happen that they just receive, say, few shares as against the present fair value of the company. So valuation is required again. Can an Indian company utilize the net worth of Indian subsidiary or a holding company for investing in a JV was abroad? Now, the 400% limit which I mentioned, now this 400% limit has to be as of the last audited balance sheet of the Indian company. Many times, let's say, we see that Indian company is not having sufficient net worth, but they see that there is a good business opportunity. If they are allowed, they can make good business revenue abroad, and this will help India as a country to receive more foreign exchange from the overseas. And why not such business avenues proposals be allowed? I mean, just because Indian company is having bit less than sufficient net worth, they should not be deprived of this business opportunity. So what RBI has done is that in the regulation, they have allowed that they can utilize the net worth of its Indian subsidiary or its Indian holding company. Okay, so we were on this case study about the net worth which the Indian company could use of the Indian subsidiary or its parent, Indian parent, to the extent not availed by the holding company or the subsidiary. Now, the regulation is that holding companies holds at least 51% direct stake in the Indian company, or the Indian party holds at least 51% direct stake in the subsidiary company, or the holding or the subsidiary company has to furnish a letter of disclaimer for the same in favor of the Indian party. Now, this facility is of course not available for the registered partnership firm. So in case of companies, they can have the net worth of the direct parent or the direct subsidiary company also utilized, provided that that particular entity furnishes a disclaimer that they have not utilized the net worth for their transactions. Next, can an Indian party capitalize the proceeds of the exports to its overseas JV boss? Yes, so this is very much permitted. They can also capitalize. So against that export, instead of getting the fund flow into country, they can get the shares and report it as an ODI transaction. So capitalization of exports is also a permissible mode of doing ODI transaction, you can say. Next, valuation certificate, up to what period is acceptable? Unless, as I discussed in case of FDI transaction, here also it has to be as of transaction time only. There is no timeline as such defined by RBI that how much older a valuation certificate could be. Reason being, requirement of valuation certificate or valuation is more associated to derive comfort that this is the value as of the transaction time. So again, no timeline frame has been given by RBI in terms of how old it could be. It has to be as of the transaction time only. And I mean, some banks allow 3 months, some banks follow 6 months, etc. On a case-to-case basis, it should be checked with the banker. But again, it's not the responsibility of the banker, rather it's the responsibility of the corporate and the CA, who believes that this value, even though it's 6 months older, is the present value of the overseas company. So very important that valuation certificate which is referred is as latest as the date of transaction. Next, Indian entity invested in an overseas concern which has or will have FDI into India. Is this allowed? So here basically, as I discussed during FDI presentation, that this kind of structures which can have a situation where, let's say, you make an ODI and then from that ODI you make an FDI back to country. So this is something not a bona fide structure. It is not allowed. Reason being, here what happens is that Indian company which has done ODI will end up with a round tripping of funds. So round tripping of funds is cannot be viewed as a bona fide. That is clarified by RBI in the FAQ also. That's one. Second, this FAQ came in some 2 years ago. It doesn't mean that either to till now whatever transactions were there which had FDI through ODI were under automatic route or were doable. That's not the case. Even the FAQ is just a clarification. This is like the regulation was always there that ODI transactions are allowed only in ODI, only in bona fide business transactions. So getting FDI from an ODI is not doable. Now again, there could be a situation where, let's say, Indian company has done the ODI and subsequently there is FDI. That's one structure. Second, Indian company invest into an ODI company and ODI company is already having stepped down subsidiary in India. Even though in both the cases it is not allowed. I mean, Indian company cannot say that the company's structure was already in existence and their money has not been round tripped back to country. They have just invested into an existing company which had already having FDI into the country. Hence, there is no fault on them or there is no non-compliance. So in both the cases, it is not doable. Reason being, this doesn't seem to be a bona fide structure. Because if the Indian company wanted to own another Indian company, why not they own directly rather than routing it through overseas structure? That's one. Second, in second scenario which I mentioned, where, let's say, Indian company is already having an overseas company and that then overseas company has invested in overseas company and overseas company is already having an FDI into India. So in those situations also, of course, while approval is required, but there could be 1% remote possibility to get the approval by explaining the entire structure to RBI, because it's quite possible that overseas company has geographical presence across. They have various companies across the globe. As a part of that, let's say they have some 1% of their total asset, or hardly few percent, let's say, invested into India. So idea is that it's not that they derive substantial revenue from the Indian business. If they have just a minuscule investment sitting in India as a part of their global strategy to have presence across the globe, then it makes a justifying case that they can still apply to RBI, and RBI may, on a case-to-case basis, may permit. But a reverse situation where let's say they do not have any operational operating revenue in the overseas country where the investment is done, and that they derive their entire income or a substantial part of the income from the India operation only, then it's definitely not a bona fide structure, and surely not doable. And we have seen cases where RBI has ask the companies to unwind such structures and close down either the ODI company or do the share transfer such that Indian company owns the ultimate Indian companies directly, or let's say, ask the overseas company to sell out the stake in the FDI entity. So either way, idea is that requirement from RBI has been that such structures are not allowed and structures should be unwound. So that's all about ODI. Okay, I'll just see the chat box if there are any questions. Okay, I think I will not be able to see Mangesh.
Maybe okay, I will read out the question.
Yes, please.
Many times we come across ODI of small amount, say US $500 by credit card. So is it allowed because it is not routed through AD?
Yeah, so this is not allowed actually. It's from the permissible sources of funding ODI. Credit card is not a permissible source of doing ODI. It will require post facto regularization, and RBI might allow it depending upon the case, facts, justification, etc. Or RBI may also ask for compounding if the case fact is not well explained. Normally, we have seen cases where RBI has allowed, but with Indian company opting for compounding.
Okay. So next question is it possible for wholly owned over a subsidiary of overseas to raise finance against security of Indian properties of parent Indian company? Parent Indian company has land and buildings in India, and it's wholly owned over subsidiary overseas wants to raise finance for its operations over there. So is it permissible?
Okay, so you mean to say this is the security of Indian company's asset?
Yeah.
So only route available is the SBLC actually. I mean, so those securities Indian company can offer as a security to a bank in India, and then bank in India can extend an SBLC.
Okay. Okay, so the next question is, what is the process for applying to RBI for approval for ODI transaction? How fast it is received?
Yeah, so here basically how it works is that RBI, application to RBI, of course, needed to be through AD Bank only. Now, Indian company or the LLP who is looking for any deviation from automatic route, right? They need to frame their application along with ODI forms and everything to the AD Bank. This needs to come out in the application in terms of why that deviation. That's one. And second, whether the Indian company has otherwise compliant with all other automatic route conditions. See, for example, let's say everything is fine, but Indian company is not a caution list, is a caution listed exporter, or let's say some investigation is going on, or let's say Indian company slightly overhit the 400% limit. Okay, so assuming that all other conditions except the particular deviation, all other conditions must be compliant. So that certification needs to be mentioned in the application to RBI that everything is fine except this particular one point. And what is the rationale why the Indian entity should be permitted? For example, if let's say Indian entity is a caution listed exporter, now against the overall total exports, let's say Indian company does a particular X amount of the exports from India, and hardly say less than 1% is delayed, and that too because of some situations in the overseas country, or let's say in the overseas buyer companies, and or some dispute going on, etc. And Indian company is able to evidence that there is some kind of reason, rationale they have, and it's not a big amount as compared to their overall size of business, etc. If they explain it with all those logics and reasons, then they can very well apply to RBI for approval through the AD Bank. Now, in terms of process, how it will work is that AD Banks will also add its covering letter along with the company's application and submit to RBI. Now, when it goes to RBI, normally the TAT is anything between say 4 to 6 weeks. Nowadays, it's a bit higher, but standard TAT is 4 to 6 weeks. And for approval route cases, normally AD Bank seeks meeting with RBI, and so that queries, if any, could be resolved along with the company. They do the meeting, and queries, if any, could be clarified and explained in case RBI has. So that's how it works.
Okay. So can APR be filed on basis of unaudited balance sheet of overseas JV?
Yeah, so this can be filed provided CA or the auditor has to mention that this is not a requirement in the overseas country laws that audit is mandatory. I mean, if the audit is mandatory in the overseas country, then of course audited balance sheet should be in place. You cannot have APR being prepared basis unaudited balance sheet. But if audit is not mandatory, then yes, CA can certify this fact and report APR accordingly.
So can company receive loan proceed from overseas JV W wholly owned subsidiary and credit to EFC account?
Yeah, so loan proceeds, since not an exchange earning, right? It is not eligible for crediting to EFC account. It has to be credited to the company's current account only. I mean, converted and credited to INR account. You cannot have the same credited to exchange earning foreign currency account, because it's not really an earning. Yeah, interest portion of it, if you get an interest on the loan, then yes, that's an earning. Dividend is also an earning. So anything which is your revenue item and is indeed an earning. Export proceed is an earning. So all those earning items can be credited to EFC account, but loan proceeds or the equity receipt, FDI, any capital flow, that cannot be credited to EFC account.
Okay. Any more questions? You can unmute the mic and ask the question if anyone else. Okay, so it was an excellent presentation. I will ask CA Jabbarji to please propose vote of thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mukesh Dut and the respected conveners. It has been an excellent presentation, sir, with respect to the many factors such as sectoral caps, pricing guidelines, eligible instruments, overseas direct investments. It was a very lucid presentation with good presentation and depth, and you have explained very well the technical aspects of it and how to go in the correct way. Still, my request is before suggesting or before doing any matter pertaining to FEMA, please have a direct look at the RBI guidelines or RBI notifications, because there are a lot of changes coming day in and day out with respect to all these aspects. So before doing anything, again, be sure that you follow the correct principle and the perspectives which the RBI requires you to do it. Thank you very much, Mukesh Dutji. On behalf of the Bandrakula Complex Study Circle, I thank you on behalf of everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jabbar sir. Thank you.
Okay, I thank you everyone from behalf of the study circle. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks everyone for joining the session. Thanks a lot.